Before there was a United States, before there were grand avenues or marble capitals, there was a fragile string of settlements clinging to the edge of a vast and unfamiliar continent. In the 1600s, Colonial America was not yet a nation. It was an experiment, uncertain, divided, and deeply human. Through surviving maps, engravings, colonial sketches, and archaeological records, we have carefully reconstructed these early settlements using advanced artificial intelligence. Each structure, shoreline, and timber frame has been analysed against contemporary accounts and material evidence to create historically informed, photorealistic scenes. What you're about to see is not imagination, but a careful visual restoration of a world long vanished. Imagine standing on the banks of the James River in 1607. Before you rises Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. The air is thick with humidity and the smell of brackish water. Mosquitoes hum relentlessly. Inside a triangular wooden palisade, roughly 100 men struggle to survive. Their fort is crude, timber walls, thatched roofs, a small church, and storehouses built in haste. Beyond the walls stretches a dense forest belonging not to England, but to the Powhatan Confederacy. Notice how precarious everything feels. Supplies are limited, fresh water is scarce. Historians estimate that by the winter of 1609 to 1610, the so-called starving time, only 60 of the roughly 500 settlers survived. Contemporary accounts describe famines so severe that leather and vermin were consumed for sustenance. Yet even here, in this fragile outpost, the seeds of transformation are present. Tobacco, introduced commercially by John Rolfe in 1612, would soon reshape Virginia's economy. By mid-century, thousands of pounds were exported annually to England, creating wealth for plantation owners while binding the colony to transatlantic trade and eventually to enslaved labor. Now we move north to Plymouth in 1620. The coastline is harsher here. The wind off the Atlantic cuts through heavy wool cloaks. The Mayflower's passengers, separatists seeking religious autonomy, construct simple wooden dwellings along the shore. Smoke rises from stone chimneys. The meeting house stands at the center of the village, doubling as church and defensive structure. Look closely at the arrangement of homes. They are orderly, deliberate. Unlike Jamestown's commercial beginnings, Plymouth is rooted in faith. The settlers sign the Mayflower Compact, pledging to form a civil body politic. It is a modest document, yet it represents an early exercise in self-governance. But survival remains uncertain. Nearly half of the original settlers perish during the first winter. Assistance from the Wampanoag people proves critical. Corn cultivation, fishing techniques, and local knowledge sustain the colony. In 1621, a harvest celebration, later mythologized as the First Thanksgiving, marks a fragile moment of cooperation. Colonial America in the 1600s is not a unified landscape. It is a patchwork of competing ambitions. Now imagine standing in Boston by the 1630s. Founded by Puritans under John Winthrop, the town rises along a narrow peninsula. Timber houses cluster tightly. A wooden meeting house crowns the hill that will later be called Beacon Hill. Ships anchor in the harbour, their masts forming a forest against the grey sky. Boston grows rapidly. By 1640, it is the largest settlement in New England, with nearly 1,000 residents. The streets are unpaved, muddy after rain. Livestock wander freely. The air carries the scent of wood smoke and salted fish. This colony is driven by a powerful vision. Winthrop speaks of creating a city upon a hill, a model Christian society. Yet beneath the rhetoric of piety lies strict social control. Religious dissenters such as Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson are banished. In seeking freedom from persecution, the Puritans established their own rigid orthodoxy. Further south along the Chesapeake, plantation estates expand steadily. Tobacco fields stretch toward the horizon. Indentured servants labor under contracts that promise eventual freedom. By 1660, however, African slavery becomes increasingly codified in colonial law. The labor system begins to harden into racial hierarchy, a contradiction that will echo through centuries. Now we travel westward from the coast into the frontier. The forest is immense. Towering trees block much of the light. Settlers clear land slowly, cabin by cabin. The edge of European settlement pushes gradually inland, often at violent cost. Relations with native nations vary from trade to open conflict. In 1675, King Philip's War devastates New England, leaving thousands dead and entire villages burned. It becomes one of the deadliest conflicts in early American history relative to population. Look at the settlements after the war. Charred timbers, rebuilt palisades, tightened defenses. Fear lingers in every watchtower. Now we move to the middle colonies. In 1664, the English seize New Amsterdam from the Dutch, renaming it New York. The harbour bustles with commerce, furs, timber, grain. Unlike the more homogeneous New England towns, this colony is remarkably diverse. Dutch merchants, English traders, Jewish refugees, enslaved Africans, and indigenous traders share its narrow streets. Further south, William Penn founds Pennsylvania in 1681. Philadelphia is planned with wide streets and orderly grids, reflecting Enlightenment ideals. Penn envisions religious tolerance and fair dealings with native nations. For a time, relative peace and prosperity follow. By the end of the 1600s, colonial America remains fragile, but undeniably growing. The population, which numbered only a few thousand at the century's start, surpassed 250,000 by 1700. Ports expand, trade networks solidify, institutions, churches, assemblies, courts take root. Yet tensions simmer beneath the surface. Economic dependence on England deepens. Slavery becomes entrenched. Conflicts with native nations escalate. Religious divisions persist. Colonial America in the 1600s is a world of ambition and hardship, faith and contradiction, survival and expansion. It is not yet revolutionary, but the foundations are being laid. The wooden forts and meeting houses of this century will one day give way to brick cities and political upheaval. But for now, as dusk settles over Jamestown's palisade and Boston's harbour darkens beneath a cold Atlantic sky, the experiment continues, uncertain, determined, and quietly transformative. As the 1600s draw to a close, colonial America is no longer a fragile scattering of wooden forts. It is a structured, expanding society tied firmly to the Atlantic world. Yet the century has left scars: war, rebellion, enslavement, displacement. And these forces shape what comes next. Now we move inland along the rivers of New England after King Philip's War. The forest, once thick and seemingly endless, shows clearings where villages once stood. Contemporary accounts suggest that dozens of English towns were destroyed between 1675 and 1676. Native communities suffered even greater devastation. Thousands were killed, sold into slavery, or forced westward. Entire alliances fractured. Imagine standing beside the charred remains of a frontier homestead. The air still smells faintly of ash. Rebuilt houses now stand slightly farther apart, and defensive perimeters are tightened. Watchtowers are reinforced. Trust has thinned. The war shifts the balance of power permanently in New England, opening vast tracts of land to colonial expansion while deepening divisions between settlers and indigenous nations. Now we move south again to the tobacco plantations at the century's end. The social order is more rigid than it was 50 years earlier. Laws in Virginia and Maryland clearly define racial categories. Enslaved Africans and their descendants are bound for life. In 1691, Virginia passes legislation prohibiting interracial marriage and formalizing racial hierarchy. What had once been a colony of shifting labor systems becomes a society structured around permanent enslavement. Notice the growth in scale. Large plantation houses, though still simple by European standards, reflect wealth accumulated through export agriculture. Warehouses along rivers hold barrels of tobacco awaiting shipment. By 1700, Virginia alone exports tens of millions of pounds of tobacco annually. The Atlantic trade connects planters to London merchants, Caribbean sugar estates, and African slave ports in a vast commercial web. Now we move to Philadelphia in the 1690s. Unlike the older colonies, Pennsylvania presents a different rhythm. William Penn's vision of religious tolerance has attracted Quakers, German settlers, and others seeking freedom of worship. Streets are laid out in a rational grid. Brick houses begin to replace timber ones. The Delaware River bustles with small craft and ocean-going vessels. Imagine walking through the marketplace. Farmers sell grain grown in fertile interior valleys. Artisans display tools, leather goods, and textiles. Unlike the plantations south, family farms dominate here. Slavery exists, but on a smaller scale than in Virginia or Carolina. Yet, even in Pennsylvania, tensions simmer. Border disputes arise. Relations with native nations remain complex, alternating between negotiation and friction. The balance of peace requires constant diplomacy. Now we return to New York at the turn of the century. The city remains diverse, a crossroads of cultures and trade. Enslaved Africans make up a significant portion of the population, working in homes, docks, and small farms. Dutch influences linger in architecture and language. Anglican churches rise alongside Dutch Reformed congregations. Picture the harbour at dawn. Masts sway against a pale sky. Dockworkers haul cargo. Merchants tally accounts by candlelight. The colony is profitable, yet still dependent on decisions made in London. Governors answer to the Crown. Navigation acts regulate trade. Imperial authority shapes economic life. Across the colonies, institutions have matured. Representative assemblies debate local taxes and laws. Courts adjudicate disputes. Churches maintain moral order. Education expands slowly. Literacy rates in New England, in particular, climb higher than in many parts of Europe. And yet, authority remains layered and distant. Colonists consider themselves English subjects, protected by English law. They celebrate royal events, toast the monarch, and rely on imperial military power. But they also grow accustomed to self-rule in daily matters. Now imagine standing at a coastal bluff overlooking the Atlantic in 1700. Behind you stretch 13 English colonies in various stages of development. Together, their population exceeds 250,000. Fields and forests interweave with settlements. Trade ships depart regularly. African slavery is entrenched. Native nations have been pushed back, but remain powerful in many regions. The 1600s have been a century of survival, conflict, adaptation, and consolidation. Colonial America has evolved from uncertain outposts to an integrated network of communities bound by commerce and shared experience. The transformations of this century will echo forward. Plantation economies will deepen, cities will expand, imperial policies will tighten. New generations, American-born, ambitious, and increasingly self-aware, will inherit both opportunity and contradiction. The meeting houses and forts of the 1600s are humble compared to what will follow, yet they are the foundation. The palisade walls of Jamestown, the meeting house at Plymouth, the brick streets of Philadelphia, the plantations along the James River, these places form the architectural and social groundwork of a future nation. Today, when you walk the historic streets of Boston, Williamsburg, or Charleston, stand on layers built during this century. Beneath modern pavement lie remnants of timber posts and early foundations. Beneath political institutions lie charters and compacts drafted in uncertain times. Colonial America in the 1600s was neither inevitable nor unified. It was shaped by environment, ambition, fear, faith, and commerce. It expanded through cooperation and conflict alike. It created wealth while entrenching injustice. It fostered local autonomy while remaining loyal to a distant crown. The world that emerged by 1700 was stable enough to endure, but restless enough to change. The story does not end here. In the century that follows, these colonies will grow wealthier, more populous, and more assertive. Ideas of liberty and governance will evolve. Tensions between imperial authority and colonial autonomy will intensify. But all of that rests upon the foundations laid in the 1600s, a century of timber and tidewater, sermons and rebellions, trade winds and frontier clearings. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe to continue exploring the past through carefully crafted historical reconstructions. And let me know which city we should reconstruct next. This is David, and I will see you in the next era.